All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Lisa Sawsville, and I'm with Vermont Coverts, Woodlands for Wildlife. And we're hosting Keith Thompson today from the Forest Parks and Recreation Department to talk about the new UVA Forest Reserve category. And this is a really interesting aspect that's been added to our current use or use value appraisal program. And Keith's going to give us the ins and outs so we can understand who and where might qualify for this unique program. We'd like to thank Vermont Woodlands Association for helping us promote this and so everybody knows about it and being a co-sponsor. And at this moment, Keith, I'm going to turn it over to you to tell a little bit about yourself as well as all of us about the Forest Reserve program.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Lisa. My name is Keith Thompson. I'm the Private Lands Program Manager with Vermont Forest Parks and Recreation. And as Lisa shared, I'll be presenting on the Reserve Forest Land Program enrollment category today. And just by way of background, I've been a consulting forester in the past, grew up in Vermont, in Waterbury. Was a consulting forester and then was briefly the Chittenden County forester, but came into this role around 2015. And so in my role, I work with the county foresters administering the current use program and helping landowners steward their forest land. I know that a lot of folks have been really interested in the reserve forest land category. It offers some new opportunities for management within the use value appraisal program. And as Lisa said, we'll take some of today to talk about this. I'm going to go through the presentation, and my hope is that we've got about 20 minutes for questions towards the end. But with that, we'll kick it off. So, can folks see my screen here?
Yes, everything looks great, Keith.
Great. All right. So just for an overview of what we're going to cover, I want to provide some context for this. Reserve forest land is a subcategory of the forest land enrollment category in the use value appraisal. So I want to lay the foundation for some of the pieces of use value appraisal and then touch on reserve forest land. Because reserve forest land is really about managing for old forest, I want to spend some time talking about what is an old forest and where are most of our forests today. And then with that as a foundation, talk about eligibility, what lands are eligible, and how to manage lands that are going to be enrolled in reserve forest land. And then what's the process for getting land enrolled, and then we'll jump into questions and discussion. So with that, use value appraisal, it's a program that started around 1980, and starting on July 1st, the purpose of the program is going to be to preserve the working landscape, the rural character of Vermont, and protecting the ecological systems and natural resources. So as we can see here, the working landscape, rural character, and natural ecological systems are all part of the purposes of this program. There are two main enrollment categories: agricultural land and forest land. And so for purposes of this presentation, I'm really going to focus on the forest land enrollment category, because it's under this category, forest land enrollment, that reserve forest land sits. When land is enrolled as forest land or agricultural land, the land gets taxed at its use value instead of its fair market value. So if land is enrolled as forest land, it is taxed at $187 per acre when it's less than a mile from a road. And there's another category within forest land when the land is really far from a main road, and it's valued at $140 per acre. For tax purposes. Agricultural land that's enrolled in the program is valued at $456 per acre, or taxed at a value of $456 per acre. And the tax department administers that side of the program. So when land is enrolled as agricultural land, The tax department administers that side. When land is enrolled as forest land, Forest Parks and Recreation will navigate that side of it. For some context, there are some mechanisms and standards that apply to land enrolled as forest land. So mentioned what the values are. Land enrolled as forest land needs to adhere to certain standards established by the commissioner of the department. And so when reserve forest land was getting created, a certain set of standards were created, and those standards define how land enrolled in the program needs to be managed, what it needs to be managed for, how plans that are describing forests and defining that management need to be, what details they need to include. And anytime land is enrolled in the program, there's a lien that's a conditional lien that's put on the property that ensures that that land is not developed and that it be managed for the purposes of the enrollment category it's enrolled in. Any land enrolled in as forest land, whether it be productive forest land or reserve forest land, needs to be managed according to a management plan. And it's a management plan that's updated every 10 years. And then when activity is implemented, whether it be for saw timber or to maintain the ecological values of an ESTA, of a significant treatment area, which is another enrollment option, then a management activity report needs to be submitted by February 1 of the year following that activity. So all these are, this presentation isn't to detail all those standards and cover all that, but it's the framework in which the forest land category has been administered for a long time. And it's the same framework that applies for reserve forest land. So I think a lot of folks who are paying attention to this enrollment category are already pretty familiar with what's required in the current use program when land is enrolled as forest land. Most of those, almost all of those requirements are the same for reserve forest land. We'll touch on a few of the differences. But again, I want to kind of provide some more context here. And the context that really brought about reserve forest land was this, that most of Vermont's private land is, most of Vermont's forest land is privately owned. And much of Vermont's forest land is enrolled in use value appraisal. And so about 55% of eligible parcels are enrolled, about 70% of eligible acres. And so when we think about what do we want from our forests, land that's enrolled in use value appraisal plays a major role in supporting those values and those conditions. Something that has been recognized is that old forest is really important, but it's also pretty much absent in Vermont as a functional component of the landscape. To put that into more context, about most of our land is between this 90 to 100 years old, which is relatively young for forests. And at a time when we're dealing with climate change and biodiversity crises and crises, things like that, it's really important to be thinking about what are the tools in our toolbox in terms of supporting those. And our forests play a really important role. And we are lacking old forests. Our forests are very young here. And so what does that look like? And I think a starting point is, well, if they're young, what's an old forest to start? So an old forest is not just that it's old trees, it's that the forest has characteristics that confer really important values and functions. And some of those are described here. So an old forest has gaps created by natural disturbance from windstorms and things like that. An old forest will have trees on the ground that are rotting. They're in various stages of decay. it'll have large diameter trees, and not just large diameter trees, but old trees that where each tree will have a lot of different habitats, broken limbs, cavities, certain bark textures that carry lichen and other things like that that can be not exclusive to old forests, but can be at higher densities or higher frequencies in old forests. And then old forests also have multiple canopy layers. So you can see in this depiction, you don't just have an overstory, a high overstory. You have trees at every level, and those trees at every level provide a lot of functions and values. They're habitats for nesting birds. Certain insects prefer certain light conditions and feed in certain parts of the forest. Also, if there is a major disturbance, an ice storm or a windstorm that affects a certain part of the forest, having young trees in the forest already established helps it be more resilient and respond to that disturbance and regenerate and heal itself. So forests that exhibit this variety of conditions at this frequency are pretty rare in our forests. And so old forests provide a lot of native biodiversity, wildlife habitat, hydrologic regulation, carbon storage, resilience, and localized cooling and climate buffering. And it's not just because they're old, it's because these forests have these characteristics. It's these characteristics that confer these values. So to get all these functions, you need to have large old trees, variability in tree density, down wood, multiple canopy layers, standing dead trees, and regeneration, and unique plant communities in the understory. So this really informs a couple of things, recognizing that, okay, we don't have a lot of this and it's valuable. And so in a program like UVA, it's really worth considering, and why this enrollment category was created, that it's worth ensuring that there are places in our forests where this is possible. And it takes time to develop these conditions. In our forests are 90 to 110 years old, and they are just beginning to develop those characteristics that provide all those different values. And so naturally they occur at certain stages, and they get to a certain frequency over time. And so this timeline kind of suggests that as forests develop naturally, around, if they're at 100 years old, at around 200 years old, the trees begin to reach a certain benchmark of tree diameter. And that's one of the many characteristics that begin to confer those old forest functions and values, those large trees. And also those large trees are really kind of on the leading edge of when you begin to accrue old forest values and functions, because as we remember that list, standing dead trees, down wood, a lot of our forests, the values are unique when the standing dead trees are exceptionally large. You can imagine that a standing dead tree that's 10 inches provides different habitat for different species than a standing dead tree that's 24 inches in diameter. A bear or a fisher can fit in a large standing dead tree that's 24 inches. And many species, but many fewer species, can fit in that 10-inch diameter tree. And the same is true for down wood. If you've ever been in the woods and seen a large dead tree on the ground, the amount of water that tree can hold, or you can imagine how many tree seedlings begin to grow on a large dead tree, and how much water that can hold even during droughty conditions. It's very unique, especially when we're dealing with climate change and have hotter longer, drier spells at times, the ability of parts of our forest, like down dead wood, to retain moisture and provide opportunities for regeneration to continue to have access to water, or salamanders to find refuge, things like that. So these characteristics are really valuable, and part of why old forests are unique and special and worth managing for. And so it's for all these reasons that reserve forest land was created as a subcategory, and also why it was designed the way it was, that it's in statute when it was created. Its management purpose is for accrual and protection of old forest functions. So to emphasize that, the enrollment category is for management for accrual and protection of old forest functions and values, and the associated characteristics that confer those values. And so management on reserve forest land can include passive or active management, inclusive of the range of strategies, when those strategies are consistent with all other standards. Before digging into the specifics of the requirements, it's really helpful to think about, if old forests are where we want to go with some of our forest land in the state. And I want to emphasize some of our forest land in the state. It's helpful to think of, independent of use value appraisal, how would I do this? What are my options? There's a really cool resource. It was published last year. It's called Restoring Old Growth Characteristics to New England and New York's Forests. And Tony D'Amato and Paul Catanzaro wrote this with a team of folks. And maybe, Lisa, if you're able, you can post a link to it in the chat. It's on the Reserve Forest Land website.
Will do.
Cool. In it is this illustration, and a lot of what I'm sharing here references that. It's just a really cool document that thinks really objectively about what are the values and strategies to get to old forests, and thinking about it not as an either or option, but as a spectrum of strategies that can be integrated into active management for saw timber, or really framed either really focusing on restoration of old forest, old growth characteristics that can include both active and passive strategies. Active strategies would be strategies that can that use human decisions to kind of accelerate the development of old forest characteristics, and passive strategies would be those that allow nature to take its course. And there are pros and cons to both strategies. Certainly there are implications for timing and things like that, whatever strategy you're using. And this illustration helps to consider some of the trade-offs, and I'll just touch on a few of these because it's helpful later on. When there's a strong timber management focus, and timber management can be really complementary with other objectives, but if there's a strong timber management focus, it might be that there are just a few legacy trees left in the woods, trees that are left to live out their natural life. They provide seed, they provide that large tree function, but they may not be left at the same density you would expect to see in an old growth forest. You can move in the spectrum along towards more active old growth restoration by having a larger percentage of trees retained while still harvesting and selling some wood, and then also cutting and leaving some trees, perhaps trees that don't have a higher economic return, but can really contribute to build the downwood component of a forest that's lacking it. More intentional strategies can leave much higher numbers of legacy trees, 25 to 50% of the trees in a forest being left as legacy, and then creating gaps in the forest to advance regeneration and really bring in that component. And then also actively thinning between trees, because trees will grow at a certain rate. And if one of the primary characteristics of old forests is to have large trees, there are strategies to accelerate the development of that characteristic. And we can go further down and get to a point where nothing is removed from the woods, but there may be active management to accelerate those characteristics, growing trees faster, things like that, to really move the needle faster than might otherwise occur. And that's one strategy. I think that's really exciting to think about how that might be used. And in some places, things are really doing really well on their own. And that letting nature take its course may be a really exceptional way to accrue old forest characteristics. And so I think the right approach is really going to depend on landowner objectives, where the forest is at, what some of the stressors are. There are some things like invasive plants or water quality problems that can really be barriers to developing those old forest characteristics. So independent of current use, there's a range of strategies to do this management. It's worth considering, and I'll share how this might work in a little bit, but I shared the timeline before. There's a passive pathway to old forest, and you can see how long it takes to get to that large tree benchmark. And this is really an average. It's going to vary by site, and this is for certain forests. But it might be 100 years for forests, many of Vermont's forests, to get to that large tree benchmark. And so for 100 years, there's patience and continuity. Trees are falling, giving space to new trees, and they're growing up. With an active strategy, that large tree benchmark can be achieved much faster in some places. And to illustrate what that can look like, here's a forest that's kind of an example of what many of our forests look like. It's about 100 years old. There's not a lot of standing dead trees or down wood. There's not a lot of regeneration. There are some places where trees are starting to fall and regeneration is starting to get established, but not a bunch. And with some thoughtfully designed active management, some trees can be removed and creating small gaps. And some trees can be designated as legacy trees and thinning between some others that are really the future of that old forest, giving them space to grow. This would take a lot of care and thought, but it's also not particularly unique to this strategy. It's something that can be easily integrated into how forests are managed today, and a lot of folks take this approach already. With some added attention to some of these details, I think it can be a really effective strategy. To illustrate how this might change over time, as those gaps are created, you can see near A and B, you get some regeneration established after a few years. The trees with the L, those are legacy trees. Those are trees that were left intentionally and given more space to grow larger, faster. You have the down wood that was cut and left, that begins to decompose and begin to contribute to those values and functions. And then 30 years after, you get more stratification of the canopy. You have these legacy trees are even larger, and then you get to have some snags beginning to fall. And this this process, at 30 years after active management, you might have this condition. If it were left passively, it might continue on a very similar trajectory in some respects, but it might be a longer timeline. And again, that's a consideration independent of UVA, is consideration that a landowner may choose to say, I really want to get old forests quickly and really restore the forest and invest a lot of energy in that. They can choose this approach, and there are resources to help make that happen. And RCS can help, and also when thoughtfully done, some removal of saw timber can help pay for this and even offer landowners some return on that. And so those strategies, passive or active, can be applied in the reserve forest land category. But I share all that to really stress that that's what this enrollment category is about. It's about managing for old forest characteristics and the values and functions that those characteristics confer. So I'll jump into some of the standards and the eligibility. So as I mentioned at the beginning, reserve forest land is a subcategory of the forest land category. And so the same mechanisms that apply to productive forest land apply to reserve forest land. So there are management standards, a lien applies, there's a management plan required every 10 years, management activity reports need to be submitted, things like that. What's unique about reserve forest land is that there's a certain eligibility requirement, and some of it parallels the existing eligibility requirement. So productive forest land, you need to have 25 acre parcel, 20 of which is forest land that's going to be actively managed. One of the things that I talk to consulting foresters and landowners about is, if the parcel is eligible today for productive forest land, it may be eligible for reserve forest land. If it's not eligible today for productive forest land because it doesn't meet the acreage requirements or doesn't have enough forest cover, it's not going to be eligible for reserve forest land. So we still have kind of the base pool of eligible properties. But there are some additional details for eligibility of reserve forest land. The idea behind reserve forest land eligibility requirements were that the current use program, as I introduced it, is really about maintaining the working landscape and the rural character of Vermont. And so the majority of land that's going to be eligible for the program is going to be managed for saw timber. But we know that there are properties out there that have a real high density of conditions that create barriers to good timber management, and conditions that have really great ecological value, that really provide a justification for managing for values other than saw timber. And so that's where this eligibility, these eligibility criteria came from. So on parcels that are greater than or equal to 100 acres of enrolled land, 30% or more of the enrolled parcel needs to be composed of significant and sensitive conditions. And I'll describe what those are specifically. But so parcels that are 100 acres or greater, 30% or more of the enrolled parcel acres need to be composed of significant and sensitive conditions. Parcels that are less than 100 acres of enrolled land, 50% or more of the enrolled acres need to be composed of significant and sensitive conditions. So once a parcel is determined to be eligible for reserve forest land, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Once it's determined to be eligible, then some or all of the forest land can be enrolled as reserve forest land. So a landowner could choose, say, I'm going to put these 50 acres in reserve forest land, and these other 50 acres I'm going to continue to manage for saw timber as productive forest land. Landowners have that flexibility. It's not an all or nothing proposition. Both management strategies and objectives have a lot of value. Landowners may choose to enroll all of their land, and that's beyond the 30% that are significant and sensitive conditions. So if a parcel, I'll show some examples here. Before I do, though, the significant and sensitive conditions are comprised of a variety of conditions. We all know that there's various things that are ecologically important or create some barriers to some kinds of management. And so a property that has in aggregate any combination of significant and sensitive conditions that meets or exceeds those 30% or 50% thresholds will become eligible. And so what's new for this enrollment category is that there is some evaluation that's going to be necessary for any landowner considering this. And there's going to be that first question. A landowner will recognize, I'm interested in this category. I am committed to managing for old forest characteristics in this category. Am I eligible? And there'll need to be an evaluation of that property to make that determination. I'll show some illustrations, but most of the significant and sensitive conditions are already part of the current use program. The ecologically significant treatment areas, also called ESTAs, have been in place since 2010, and landowners can enroll their land in these subcategories and manage not for saw timber, but for the specific values of that ESTA. And so if you have a riparian area, you have a stream running through your property, and there's an area around that has some unique riparian function, that can be managed for riparian values instead of saw timber or in addition to saw timber. But it can, if it's enrolled in that, it needs to be managed for those values. Same is true for vernal pools and others. One thing that's new in this enrollment category is the creation of this steep slope overlay. And because lands that are really steep can be very difficult to manage responsibly, lands that are 35% slope or greater have the potential to be enrolled as reserve forest land, and those steep slopes can contribute to that eligibility threshold. So in most cases, landowners will work with consulting foresters to evaluate the eligibility. We've created some map layers and done trainings with consulting foresters about how to evaluate this. I'll look at some examples here, and shoot, there's something not working here. The images got screwed up. I apologize. I'm gonna just fix this real quick because I think the text here is really helpful for understanding. I apologize.
That's all right. You work on that. We'll have a little commercial.
Great.
One of the comments in there, I just want to address, they're asking a little bit about, and we'll get to the question at the end about how you know how to manage old growth forests, since we have no experience having it since it's all gone from Vermont. But we'll get to that question later. They do note, said, given that managed forests are already managed under current use as tree farms, and I want to explain that the current use program and the tree farm program are two different programs. The current use program is operated out of the state, and it is a reduction in the taxes, as Keith has explained, for having land enrolled as a forest. The tree farm program is actually a national program that in our state is administered through Vermont Woodlands Association and their tree farm committee. And that's really lands that are enrolled to say they're going to meet certain characteristics. They're going to manage for water, wildlife. I forget the other two that are on the sign. But that's a completely different program, and it's not like trees are being farmed like corn. So I just wanted to clarify that a little bit while
Great.
we have our commercial. How you doing there?
Doing awesome, and I am about to go back live here. I can get my, all right, and we will.
Excellent. So we're seeing that again now with the words.
Great. And you're seeing the slideshow version?
I am seeing the slideshow version with examples less than 100 acres.
Great. So here are two examples. The top example is an eligible example, and the tan color are all steep slopes. The blue are all riparian areas. They're areas around streams or wetlands or things like that. And in this example, you can see that a portion of the property is covered by steep slope. And in this example, there are 85 enrolled acres. They're all forest, and 53 acres of this significant sensitive conditions. And so this is a 100-acre example. It needs to meet or exceed 50% significant or sensitive conditions. In this top example, there's 62% significant and sensitive conditions. This parcel is eligible for enrollment in reserve forest land. And so once eligible, any of those acres, including those that are not steep slope, can be enrolled as reserve forest land, any of the forest land acres. On the bottom of this slide, this is an ineligible example. There's 71 acres of enrolled land that is inclusive of forest land plus the agricultural land on this eastern side. And in this example, there are 24 acres of significant and sensitive conditions. You can see in this property, there are both steep slope and riparian areas here. But this one only has 33% significant and sensitive conditions. So in this case, this parcel is not eligible for enrollment in reserve forest land. And I'll come back to what landowners might want to think about if they are interested in the category and they may find that they're not eligible. For parcels that are larger than 100 acres, we're looking at that 30% threshold. In this example on the top, there's 162 acres of significant and sensitive conditions comprised by both riparian areas and steep slopes. This one has 44% of its land in significant and sensitive conditions. It's eligible because it's greater than 30%. The example on the bottom has only 10% significant and sensitive conditions. It's not going to be eligible for reserve forest land. And so that's the first step that landowners are going to need to be considering when approaching this category, is determining eligibility. If a property is eligible for reserve forest land, again, I'll stress, it needs to be managed for old forest values and functions, and landowners will need to demonstrate over time that management strategy being used is making progress towards attainment of old forest characteristics. And there are some really useful benchmarks to use, but I mentioned some of those characteristics, like large trees, presence of snags, down wood. Those are things that are going to be part of the forest management plans that are described, and landowners will be able to monitor their success and accrual of those things, and also adapt their strategies to support their management for them. There are a few places where there are some bright line management requirements for reserve forest land. The acceptable management practices, these are the water quality practices that help prevent erosion on logging roads and things like that. These need to be addressed in the plan. and employed. And this is already a requirement, but recognizing that some lands enrolled as reserve forest land will be managed passively, and there won't be equipment on site again for a long time, that upon enrollment, there's a real need to identify and address those water quality deficiencies, just so that we don't find ourselves 30 years down the road with old logging roads washed out and without a plan to address them. It would be really inconsistent with those old forest goals. Also, invasive plants are one of the biggest barriers to advancing those old forest characteristics. Thinking back to that slide that we looked at the beginning, you got to have regeneration developing to replace the overstory as trees die and things like that. But if we're regenerating invasive plants instead of regenerating native trees, then our ability to provide the resilience that old forests offer, or recruit large trees into the overstory, is really going to be hindered. So there's got to be a strategy to deal with invasive plants on land that's enrolled as reserve forest land. There are some unique circumstances where it's required to accelerate the development of old forest characteristics. So many properties will be able to manage their forest passively if they choose, when those invasive plants are dealt with and the AMPs are dealt with. But if there's a plantation that isn't regenerating, and there are more details than I've provided here, but if there's a plantation comprised by a single species or dominated by species not suited to the site, then management may be required to accelerate that, to create regeneration and initiate that progress towards a diverse natural forest condition. There are some exemptions to that. So if somebody has already initiated that process, did some treatments, and it's in the process of regenerating, or Windthrow has already established some of that regeneration, then a county forester may provide an exemption to that requirement to do management to accelerate that. Salvage of trees on reserve forest land. So this is like if there's a big windstorm and it can make a mess of the property. Those are really important parts of old forests. And so salvage isn't allowed unless it's the minimum necessary to allow like use of a trail, or to address human safety or forest health concerns, and it's approved by the county forester. So salvage is allowed in the productive forest land category, but it's such an important part. These disturbances and the retention of down wood is such an important part of old forests, that it would be inconsistent with the purposes to allow that. Also, sugaring. Sap collection isn't allowed in reserve forest land with the exception of small scale collection for personal use approved by the county forester. So think like 200 taps or something like that. Sugaring is totally compatible with the productive forest land category, but not in reserve forest land. So just as an example of a condition that would require some acceleration, if this is a plantation where that's being enrolled in reserve forest land, there would need to be a strategy in this stand to create some regeneration opportunities, to get some greater species diversity in here, to get some wood on the ground, and begin the process. It doesn't need to be an ongoing, never-ending process, but it does need to begin to initiate that old forest set of characteristics, so that the values and the functions can begin to accrue. I'm just about wrapped up there. a lot of landowners considering this will be transitioning from productive forest land into reserve forest land. And it's a pretty straightforward process. Folks can know, enrollment in this category is voluntary, and eligible land may be enrolled into reserve forest land or may be transitioned out of reserve forest land when the landowner chooses and standards are met. So a landowner choosing to move into this category can move it back out if they choose to at some point in the road, or a future landowner or kid or something like that. There's a ton of value in keeping it there, but that's the choice of the landowner. If a landowner does want to transition their enrollment from productive forest land into reserve forest land, a landowner first determines eligibility, and then will document the eligibility with a revised map meeting current use standards, and then can either do it in one of two ways. An amendment would be basically going in today, amending the plan, demonstrating eligibility, and meeting all the standards for the plan, and the land can change enrollment at that point. But I think it's an important consideration that because there's a 10-year update cycle, if you do an amendment and don't collect new inventory data or things like that, then your plan is due in 3 years. Your plan update will still be due in 3 years. If you do a plan update, and that's kind of doing the full inventory, and you could do that outside of the 10-year cycle or in line with the 10-year cycle, when you do that plan update, then the next plan will be due 10 years down the road. It's just kind of resets the 10-year clock. And so that may be a decision based on how motivated you are to enroll in the reserve forest land category, or what some of the what your current plan prescribes in the very near future, and how far out your plan update is due. So those are, I think, the right approach is going to be unique to each landowner, but it's a pretty straightforward process. Something a lot of landowners interested in this category will confront is that most parcels will not be eligible. And I just want to be really upfront about that. We expect that about 15% of parcels eligible for UVA will also be eligible for reserve forest land. And I think the really important thing to consider when landowners are interested and find that they aren't eligible is management for old forest characteristics and forest products are compatible. And many critical old forest characteristics can be achieved decades sooner with thoughtfully designed management strategies. So if you or a landowner are interested in this, but find out they aren't eligible, I think it's helpful to consider, okay, if I'm interested in this, maybe there's a way to adapt my current plan to better achieve my goals, to move towards old forest goals. Or maybe we're already on track and doing it, but that'll be a valuable conversation. There's a reserve forest land website that will continue to update. Lisa, maybe you already did, or maybe you'll put this in the chat. But this is where the resources for this enrollment category are. And with that, I'm gonna end my presentation. I'll leave this up. I can see some folks might be writing down links, but we can move on to questions.
That sounds great, Keith. I've got some in the chat that I will read to you.
Great.
And so the first one really is, we don't have old growth forests, and we haven't really seen it in years. So how do they know how to achieve this old growth characteristics through management?
Sure. So there have been a lot of studies of old growth forests where they do exist. So there aren't a ton, but there are some great examples around in the Adirondacks, there's some in Maine. There are some locations in Vermont as well where the characteristics have been studied, and also we've been doing forest management for a long time and have been paying attention to what the successes are, what the failures are. Certainly any management needs to be approached with humility. There's a lot of science behind this. This Restoring Old Growth Characteristics to New England and New York's Forest is a really wonderful resource that describes how to do this and where some of the humility should be stressed and applied, but also references where some of the research comes from. And I think it's really important to be thinking about this objectively and recognizing that a lot of the values and functions that we get from old forests are unique to old forests, but not exclusive either. We've been managing for a habitat structure for coarse wooded material, for wildlife habitat, for water quality in forestry for a long time, and have a lot of practice figuring out what works and what doesn't work. And so there's a real great opportunity to apply that knowledge here. I'm gonna stop sharing so we can look at each other for this discussion.
Okay, so the next question asks a little bit about noting that it's reduced number of parcels, but that we need some old growth in the state. Might these criteria be expanded in the future?
Yes, it's a possibility. I think that there aren't plans to do it at this point so this all goes into effect July 1. There is a report that's going to be due in a few years to evaluate if this is being heavily utilized or underutilized, to what degree it's contributing to the old forest goals that we've got for the state, or failing to contribute to those.
Okay. You mentioned riparian areas when you were looking at the different characteristics, and there's a question if there's a state definition of a riparian area. Is it 50 feet on either side of a brook, or how wide a stream or brook is?
Sure. The standards that we've got basically say that if it's a perennial stream, a year-round stream, up to 100 feet on either side. If it's an intermittent stream or a wetland, it can be 50 feet on either side. Unless there's a justification for a wider area, like floodplains along some of the rivers can be very wide and have a very deep riparian function. And so a plan can make a case for a wider riparian area and be evaluated by the county forester for consideration.
One landowner wants to know, is the goal to never harvest again in these reserved forests, but just to manage them in those various ways you described?
It's a great question. And there's been a lot of discussion about that. This enrollment category is really designed to keep all management options on the table to advance these characteristics. There was a lot of interest in having opportunities to do passive management and do no management in more areas in Vermont through the current use program. And so there is part of that. But as we illustrated here, there are some opportunities to actively manage for old forest characteristics, which could take decades longer to achieve those characteristics. Excuse me, it could take decades to achieve them, while even speeding up the accrual of old forest. So it could be 50 years of management in some of these places to accrue these characteristics quickly. Even it's hard to talk about 50 years and say we're accruing things quickly, but when we're talking about forest management, timelines get extended.
One of the landowners notes that they have vast trails on their land. Is that going to be an issue? Is it a problem if they want to be in the reserve forest?
Ask that again.
They have vast trails on their property for snowmobiles?
No, I think that recreation is really compatible. I think it's worth flagging that in the plans. I think it's because at times that will be a place that was an example for, no salvage being a salvage is restricted except for approved uses, vast trails, hiking trails, things like that, or something that we think is part of our landscape and compatible with old forests at a relatively low density or cross between trails, things like that.
Great. I see, Gib, you've raised your hand. If you could type your question in the chat box, that would be great. I'd love to take it from there. So another question is, they're wondering about compatibility with like the Family Forest Carbon Program that's now available in Vermont. Is that something that will or will not be compatible with that?
I think there's potential for compatibility. There are a couple of different practices in the Family Forest Carbon Program. The compatibility is really going to be unique, parcel by parcel, but largely it will be compatible. There will likely be more compatibility between the two programs, given one of the practices that Family Forest Carbon has, growing older forests, precludes active harvesting, and more land in this enrollment category will be allowed to have passive management, which may open up the opportunity for some landowners.
That's great. I did have a question asking if I could send out the links from the last slide. I will send that out when I send the recording out. It'll be later this week, but I will send out those links within that if you didn't get a chance to write them down or you're going to look for those. There was a question of, can we plant for diversity by adding, like sort of assisted migration species into those areas?
Yes.
That was easy.
Native species being the real important part there.
Okay. Another landowner wants to know, has the tax rate for reserve forest land been established, or is that the same as any of the other current use tax rates?
It'll be the same as the forest land use value. So it's under the forest land category. That will be the value that applies to reserve forest land.
Okay, great. Gib did type in the question, so I'm going to read it. The photos that you showed of old forest would not be eligible. They were flat with no streams or ponds. What if a landowner has land that he or she wants to manage for old growth and has been doing so, but wants to discontinue harvesting trees to speed the process? Is that possible?
I think there's a lot to unpack in this. As mentioned, there's what makes a property eligible is a portion of the property, not the entirety of the property. If forest is already old growth, then that is an eligible ESTA, and absent steep slopes or streams, if it's already old growth, then it will be eligible as a significant sensitive condition and will contribute to the eligibility of a property. If a property is not eligible for reserve forest land, and it's also not eligible as an ecologically significant treatment area, then to be eligible, the landowner will need to continue to manage for forest products. And that's kind of where I ended the presentation. A lot of landowners are going to be in this situation, and landowners who are really committed to managing for old forest characteristics, but also committed to remaining in use value, will need to do some harvesting. And I really encourage those landowners to work with their consulting forester to figure out, okay, how do I thread this needle? Because managing for old forest characteristics is compatible with cutting some trees. And in fact, cutting some trees, when done well and thoughtfully, can accelerate the accrual of those characteristics in really important ways, especially given the urgency of climate change and lack of structural diversity and things on our landscape. I really hope that folks can find a way to strike that balance and get excited about how management might advance these goals.
That's great. There is, just to let people know, upcoming on June 4th, up in Derby, Vermont Coverts cooperator Alan Yale will be hosting Coverts cooperators, VWA members, and anybody who's interested in learning about how to manage for old growth characteristics on his property. And if you're not on our e-news, let me know and I can send it to you. That's June 4th. We're also going to be talking about, I'm looking for the date, hang on a second, I'm in my thing, restoring old growth characteristics, which is basically the same kind of concept. We'll be doing a walk with Ethan Tapper at Catamount Community Forest, and that's going to be on Tuesday, June 27th from 6 to 8. We're also working on some other workshops around the state just to share, if you're not eligible, what can you do? And if you are eligible, programs like this. And I think it's amazing, Keith, how UVA has changed. I remember when we introduced ESTAs in 2010, and I think, that was in response to these landowners really caring about these special areas, and FPR also caring about these special areas and finding a way to make sure these things can happen, and reserve forests sort of fall into that same category. So thank you for your thoughtful attention to these matters. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Lisa.
Let's see, a few more questions popped in. I'll do one or two more, but I want to be respectful of everyone's time. With parcels under 100 acres, is it 50% or more of significant or sensitive conditions of the required 20 forest management managed acres? They have roughly 26 acres of sensitive and significant conditions.
So it is parcels under 100 acres. It's 50% or more of the enrolled acres. Forest land plus agricultural land. So take all the enrolled acres and it's 50% or more of that total. Okay. And so I would expect if 100 acres are enrolled and there are 26 acres of significant and sensitive conditions, that eligibility threshold hasn't been met.
Great. And one person wanted a little clarification. Just to clarify what they think they heard you say is that there is no tax advantage to classifying one's forest as reserved compared to classifying it as productive. Is that correct?
Correct.
And that takes us through all our questions that we have in the chat box, and that takes us to just after 1 o'clock. I want to thank you all for joining us today. I will put the recording up for this, hopefully by the end of the week, so you can watch it again if you had any questions or refer other people to it. If you have additional questions, you're welcome to send them to me, and I will kind of compile a list and send them off to Keith, or I'm sure you can send them directly to Keith. He'd be happy to answer them as well. And we love that you joined us today. We hope you'll join us for another one of our lunchtime series that'll be coming up. If you haven't registered for our e-news, where we put all of our programs like the ones I announced on the reserve forest and old growth characteristics, you can do so on our website, which is www.vtcoverts.org. I'd like to thank you again for joining us today. And Keith, thank you so much for your time in explaining this. We really appreciate that as well.
Lisa,
hope everyone has a great afternoon.
Thank you.